I said a source because for me, inclusion in itself and by the very nature is the coming together of things. It's about the mixing of things. And so I don't want to sit here and tell you, just do this one thing and everything is going to be fine, and let that be the message. I think my message is, look at your combination of things. And I'm going to get really specific about some of the things that I think are really important that help shape the way an organization approaches inclusion and belonging. Because Eloise, you told us all of the things that are in the source. Is it possible that you could miss out some of the things and still have a good source?
Yeah, I always leave out the aubergine because I don't like aubergine. So I definitely leave that out. But what I would, so yes, you can. But I will get feedback from my children if it's a different color or a different texture, or if it tastes different. So, but you can, and you can swap things around.
Okay.
But there are some things that you can't. There's some parts of it you can't take out.
Absolutely. That's exactly, it's almost like I paid you big money to do that reading for me, right?
To hear about my cooking skills.
There will always be some things that you could swap out and move around, etc. But there are also some things that are core, that if you miss this out, I imagine it might be the tomatoes or the garlic, for example, it's not going to be as good a sauce.
No.
And so the point of this is for me to share with you what I think are the tomatoes and the garlic, the essential things that you really need and that you should be thinking about as an organization. Right. So that's the point. That's why I called it the secret sauce, because I'm going to talk about those things. I actually, in the end, came up with 10 things. So I've been thinking about it over the last few days. I landed on 10. It seems like a magical number. I'm sure there will be things that I have forgotten. I did run it past some of my peers just to see where we landed. But for me, these are the 10. And you might not agree with me on all of them, and you might have things to add, but you know what? Isn't that the whole point of today anyway, to be able to share these things with each other, right? So keep a note, and if we get to the end and you're like, Dana, I think this is really a key one, then the next time I talk about this, I might have to extend my list to 12 things or 15 things or how many ever we manage to come up with all together. So I'll just walk through, give some highlights, and I'm going to throw some client stories in as well, anonymously, of course, as we walk through, so I can tell you a little bit more about this. So the first one for me is about senior leadership and support and sponsorship. So in lots of the organizations I come to, stuff is happening at the grassroots level. It's happening with the staff, but senior leaders aren't really engaging as much as they should and could be. And some of that is because they're a little bit nervous. They might not know everything there is to know about D&I. It feels like cancel culture is running rampant and they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and everyone canceling them. Or for whatever reason, they're not as involved as they need to be. I think senior leadership sponsorship is really important. And I think while you might make great strides in the beginning without it, there will ultimately come a point where you can't get any further than where you are, because to be able to push the agenda, you need senior people who are aware, who have control over budgets, who have control over strategies and plans and agendas, and who are looking out further into the future and who know things about the organization that might not be known on the grassroots level. So one of the things I do when I go into organizations is I say, look, who is your senior leadership sponsor for this work? And having a senior leadership sponsor, by the way, doesn't mean that only one person out of the entire senior leadership team is going to engage with this. No, we want them all to be engaging as much as possible, but at least there is someone making the noise for you at that level. There's someone sharing the perspective of the work in more closed door meetings. I think this is really essential. So essential, in fact, that I put it as my number one thing on the list. I think it's really important, and I think we need to see more of it. The second thing, and now the order is just, I had to put my number one thing first, but after this, all pretty even, right? So I don't know if you've noticed this trend of wanting to boost your diversity numbers. All of a sudden, everyone's thinking about it, talking about it, and they really care about the numbers and the bottom line. So how many BAME people did we recruit in the year? What's our ethnic mix looking like? What's our gender mix looking like? And especially for the reportable things, right? All of a sudden, it's feeling like a numbers game. And it's one of my least favorite things about the space at the moment. I understand the need for targets, but what I'm trying to say is that the reality is that if you bring in a whole bunch of people and they don't feel included and like they belong, you're not going to keep them. So your gains are going to be really short-lived because you're not thinking long-term and you're only thinking about the short term. So I'm saying do things internally to boost inclusion, to make people feel like they can be a part of the organization no matter who they are, and that their voices are heard before you bring in people to have an experience of alienation and otherness, right? Sometimes when I look at clients' Glassdoor profiles, you see things like I felt like a token employee, or I felt left out and whatever. And all of these feelings are coming from putting the cart before the horse, trying to drive up the numbers, trying to make things look really good on paper without actually doing the work. And we have to start challenging ourselves to do the work. Okay, do the work, make sure that there is space for people, that people feel really comfortable. I mean, survey your existing staff, all of that stuff. See where you are before you start just ticking and bringing in the numbers. I had a really sad moment last week where a group that I work now really closely with, they created a position especially for someone who was an ethnic minority. And last week I was called into a meeting with that person to talk about what their experience of working in that organization was like. There are some days where at the end of the day, I need an ice cream at the end of the day. That was one of those days. It was an absolutely heartbreaking conversation about the way that she felt that she was selected for her characteristic and not for what she could bring to the organization. And I think when we're running the numbers, we have to be so careful and so mindful about how we make people feel, right? Mm-hmm. Inclusion work is about how people feel at its core, and less about ticking the boxes and having the numbers.
This really rings true for me, Dana, because obviously working in recruitment, diversity, is high on the agenda, and I see far too often businesses that are looking at a tick box exercise. And actually, if people don't feel like they belong, then all you're going to get in a business is that churn of staff. So, it just doesn't work. So working on the inclusion part first, absolutely, 100% agree with you. And I can see other people in the chat box are as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Eloise. Okay, what's my number 3 thing? It's representation, okay? I think we downplay the importance of representation. And to explain to you what I mean by this, I'm going to tell you a pre-pandemic story about a client of mine. They are very big in the intelligence and cyber space, and they had an issue with recruiting women. And so they actually hired me to find out why they had that issue. And as part of the work, I spoke to female staff members or female identifying staff members who had left. But also in the end, I went to their target universities to speak to some of the students who they were hoping would apply and who actually were applying for competitor firms, but not for this firm, or accepting the offer from this firm, but then when they did get the offer from if the firm offered first, but then if they did get an offer from a competing firm, deciding to take that offer instead. So they had a lot of that happening where like partway through it would look like the numbers were good, but then they had like people dropping out because they got competing offers from other companies. And there was one resounding answer from all of the students, because remember, they don't really know what the culture of that organization is. They can't truly know because they don't work there. And so they were making their decisions based on something else. And what they were basing it on is that there were no female senior leaders at that firm. So what I'm saying to you is they could not see themselves in the firm. They could not see themselves rising through the ranks of the firm, and they were questioning whether or not there was space for them. But in the other firms that they were applying to, they could see themselves reflected within the makeup of the organization beyond just the more junior levels of the staff. And I think representation is so important, and it really does matter. And if you want people to be able to feel included, that feeling of being the only one of you is something that we have to work on being able to overcome. So I've put that on the list because I keep hearing it over and over, and I hear it a lot now from younger people. And so it's surprising me less, but like people who are looking for jobs now, it always amazes me how much it matters. And it always amazes me how much I hear of people going to LinkedIn profiles for a company and looking to see all of the employees who work there to see if they can see themselves before deciding whether they want to apply or not. It's mattering more and more. And so it's something that I think we should keep an eye on.
Definitely.
The fourth one is about honesty and truth. So in some ways, I see my job as being a truth teller or a detective in a way to find out answers. And people pay me to tell them answers. And then sometimes when I do, they get really cross with me. And I mean, really, really cross with me. It's an occupational hazard because they start off wanting to hear the truth. And then when they see it, supported by data, of course, they are unwilling to be confronted with that vision of themselves. And I understand as human beings, it's human nature to be defensive. I hear it. And when we hear or see things about ourselves that we don't like, it is difficult. But I mean, you've spent this money to find out the answers. Just because you don't like the answer doesn't mean that you get, as Rhiannon has beautifully said, the alternative truth, right? There's no alternative truth. There just is the truth. And I think we have to be willing to hold that mirror up to ourselves and really look and take action based on what we see and what we hear. And just the frequency with which this is happening. And usually clients do come back after and say, look, we're sorry, we've had time to look it through. But usually the initial reaction is never happened, not here, this is totally untrue, everyone's made it up, that kind of thing. I think, we have to be more willing to confront some of the truths about ourselves and organizations. The fifth one is about internal and external lenses. And I'm going to give an example to say what I mean. There are some organizations who public facing seem to be all about inclusion and diversity. So they will ask their suppliers to go through a rigorous process to prove that they are diverse and inclusive before they hire them. They will send out the most diverse teams to pitch and bid for work. They're publishing reports about how you should be when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And then you close the door. And what is happening inside the organization is the complete opposite of everything that they are touting in the outside world. The other side of that is that internally, beautiful culture. People feel welcome, they feel included, happy to work, 10 best places to work, whatever. But then on the supplier side of things, the external facing side of things, people aren't feeling it. So like it's not coming through in the solutions that you offer, in the way that you portray yourself, the way you speak, the way you pitch, the way you talk. And so I think the journey toward inclusion is an easier one when, and gosh, easier is not even the word. It's a more holistic one where it threads through both the service that you deliver, but also the lived experience within the organization. And I think it has to be both. And I think you might choose a place where it starts, but ultimately the work should inform each other. So the stuff that you're doing in the world should reflect diversity and inclusion, but also the way that you live at home should reflect diversity and inclusion. I think it has to be the things in partnership, and too many times it's like an either or scenario. So my sixth one is about options for learning beyond the tick box. What am I talking about? You join a new company and the first thing you have to do is complete an e-learning about diversity and inclusion and how important it is. And then you will complete that e-learning again next year when this year's one has expired and you have to refresh that knowledge. And in between it, you might have like one all staff meeting where it's mentioned, and then that's the end. So that's one. Or take me back, or sometimes I get clients who say, Dana, we've thought really hard about this and we've decided what our next steps are. Let's do a 2-hour unconscious bias session. And I'm like, okay, great. And then, right? Because I'm not saying no to the 2-hour unconscious bias session, but I am saying yes and, okay? So I feel like we're taking a scattergun approach to learning in this space is the first thing. And I think we could be more deliberate about it and put out a forward plan. A forward plan that is different for each organization because it's based on where people actually are within your specific context and not on here's a cool thing that Twitter did in 2020. But also, I think that sometimes we forget that even in this space, there are multiple ways to learn. Why is it always a book? Some people do not have time to read multiple books cover to cover about D&I. I would love it if they did, but people have stuff going on. They have lives and we have so many more things, right? There's webinars, there's on conferences. Sometimes people also don't feel great about participating in a session. So what are you planning that would just allow people to sit down, shut up for an hour if they want to, and just take in some core messaging? Like, where is the blending? Why can't we have all the things? Some e-learning, some book club, some social learning, some webinars. Like, why is it always one thing? I'm getting annoyed. I'm sorry, I'm going to calm down now. But this is one of my biggest bugbears about the landscape. Everyone takes a picture of a book and they put it on Instagram and Twitter and they're like, here's what I'm reading now. Or even better, it's a stack of books on an artsy background and it's like my summer reading. What the hell? There are other ways to do this, and we have to normalize those ways. Sometimes I learn more from a 30-minute scroll of Insta or Twitter than I might like reading a whole book. And we have to let people know that it's okay to do other things.
Absolutely agree. And take a breath.
Okay. Number 7 is holding each other accountable. So I started off by talking about politeness in organizations. No one wants to tell anyone when they do something wrong. But lately I've been finding that cultures where it's okay to speak up and hold each other accountable have been managing to bring about change a lot faster than ones who don't. So there's one particular client I work with. They're absolutely adorable. They have an abbreviation that they use with each other, and it's called BB for bad bias, right? So if they hear someone saying something that's biased in a negative way, they literally say BB to each other. And it's a call out, but it's a little bit funny. No one outside of the organization has to know what it is. But most importantly, it's not finger pointy, like you just said this, I hate this. It's like a little internal mechanism that they have to hold each other accountable. And it works for them. And quite frankly, it's brilliant. And I wish I had thought about it myself. I love how they use it. That might not work in your context. There's one other firm that I work with that went for the zero tolerance approach among their senior leadership team. And what they did was, it was like no words. Okay, so they had a very toxic masculine culture, the kind where you would play shag, marry, and kill with your about your co-workers within their earshot, that kind of place. And so what we agreed with the senior leaders and directors, y'all are laughing, but this is a true story. What we agreed is that when stuff like that was happening and it was heard, whether it was in the pub or in the office or whatever, the most senior person would just say, that's unacceptable, and then get up and walk away. So you don't get my attention if you're saying stuff that is inappropriate. And it wouldn't be more than that. It was literally just, this is unacceptable. And then that person would go somewhere else, as in, it is so distasteful for me that I will not stay here and say it. And initially, it was just the directors who were doing it. Within 2 weeks, we had senior managers doing it, and then managers. And it was like this whole snowball of things that started from the top, them holding each other accountable to certain behaviors. And I think if we are doing this work, we have to be brave enough to do that.
Definitely.
The eighth one is about consequences. Right. By this, I mean, lots of times I go into organizations and people tell me things because I'm the neutral ears, and it's finally a chance to get something off their chest. And I say to them, why didn't you report it? And they say, there's no point in reporting it. Nothing is going to get done. Everyone knows about this person or this situation or this whatever that's going on, but no one does anything about it. And that always makes me really, really sad. And I think we have to be willing to have really clear consequences and implement those consequences. It's this whole thing about justice being seen to be done. And where that isn't happening, people don't step up. They don't report. They don't say anything because they think nothing is going to come about as a result of raising this issue because there have never been any consequences. I mean, sometimes there are like 20 odd reports of stuff against the same person. And then when I go in and I say, look, what are we doing about this?
Nothing.
Nothing. How can anyone ever step up to try and create change in that kind of environment when nothing is being done? Just saying. Okay, knowing the numbers, I put as number 9. And by this, I am not talking about like clear-cut targets. Let's have our gender base be 50-50. I'm not talking about that, actually. What I'm talking about is knowing where you are. And this goes back to truth. How can you know where you are on your journey if you've achieved anything over time, if you don't even know what your starting point is? You can't. How can you know? How can you track what you've been doing? Seriously, if you don't know where you are? And how do you send a message that you're committed to this if you don't at least set some baseline objectives, right? And an objective could be something as simple as in the Pulse survey or whatever employee survey that you're running, we want to take the answer for this above a certain percentage beyond where it is now. It could be as simple as that. Or we want to reduce the number of complaints in a year. Like, let's get creative about the metrics that we use. Not everything has to be so intense, right? But let's start somewhere and let's publicize what those objectives are and the way that we're going to measure them is what I would say. Like, know where you are, because if you don't know where you are, you can't tell where you're going to. And so the last one is grace and kindness. So I mentioned at the beginning that I started this work in a space where it was okay to make mistakes then, because we were all figuring it out as we go along. And I think that no one is perfect, not even me. I don't write on any of my social medias or anywhere that I'm an expert in D&I. I think it is really difficult to make that claim about yourself in a space that is always evolving. So I would say I specialize in this area, but I think we have to take that expert terminology away. And I think we have to do more to let people know that it's okay to make a mistake. But what's important is that when you make a mistake, you accept it without being defensive. You strive to do better the next time and not do that mistake again, but also that you forgive yourself. I feel like there's a trend happening now of people publicly beating themselves up and shaming themselves about the mistakes that they made. They made a mistake, they got to write a whole blog post about it, they got to tweet about it, put themselves up to the internet of shame, right? We also have to just let each other know that it is okay not to be perfect. Right? And that nobody can really be expected to be perfect in this space. And so I say to companies as well, look, if someone does something once, we shouldn't be having an HR report for that one, unless it's something really egregious and horrible, right? But even so, can we not give people a chance to correct their mistakes, to understand what they've done wrong? I feel like we just go so hardcore now. You say one wrong thing and then everyone is like, right? I just feel like we need to be a little bit more gentle with each other and a little more kind in general in the space, because everyone is still learning. I am still learning as well, and this is my job. We are all learning, and I think we need to be more gracious with each other in that space. So there we go. 10. That's the 10, Eloise.
Excellent. Rhiannon's asked a question before I go on to my next question. She said, with 10 ingredients, which one do we start with?
So the answer to that depends on where you are as an organization. So if you already have the senior leadership stuff nailed, it won't be that one, right? I think you choose the thing that's going to make the biggest impact immediately. So that's always my answer. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but people are a bit impatient when it comes to change. They like to see stuff being done, and there's this whole sense of instant and nowness. And so I think if you're starting off on your journey, why aren't we open about giving people a little bit of now? So if you see something on the list that you can action pretty swiftly and give people that sense of now, I would go for it. Also, if you see something on the list that you know is a big deal within your context and could legitimately make a massive change in the way that people see and experience the organization, go for that one. But it depends on your context. I hope that helped. I'm seeing you nodding a bit. Okay.
And Joanne's asked a question as well, and I will come on to my next question. How do we pick the truly diverse and inclusive companies to work for? So, as you previously said, so many display the right things,
absolutely,
externally, but internally the environment isn't.
So I always advise starting your search on Glassdoor. That the power of anonymity gives people the freedom to be honest in a way that they can't in other places. And it's also a channel that isn't controlled by the company itself. So I would start with looking there. Also, I think that in some ways, yes, the organizations can put out the big glossy, but there will be things that they can't really hide. So I look up organizations, and I look, in Google, if you search for a company, their own stuff is going to come up first. But if you click the news tab to the top, you can see things that have been written about them. And you can also type the company name in Twitter and see if anyone is saying anything about them as well. So back channels are really good to be able to figure some of that stuff out. Also, if you look on LinkedIn, you might see connections who know someone who works there. That's a good way to find out as well. But you need the back channels to be able to figure things out like that.